My name is Evelyn Claire Martin. I'm 38 years old. I live in a modest two-story row house in Columbus, Ohio, on a street that smells like cut grass and fried food on summer nights. For the last year, my life has been measured in appointments, pill bottles, and the humming rhythm of a hospital-grade oxygen concentrator that sits near my bed like a patient companion. I used to be a middle school English teacher. I read aloud for a living. Now I read my prescriptions out loud to remember which ones go with breakfast. Emotionally, I am raw. So raw that the smallest kindness feels like a bandage and the smallest betrayal feels like a cut reopened. If I sound like I'm confessing, it's because I am. I'm sitting on the edge of honesty in the only place that feels like mine, the narrow bent of our mattress where the light from the street lamp falls through the blinds. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. It began, ironically, with an ambulance siren and a blue curtain. One late winter night last year I collapsed in the kitchen, dizzy and gasping. Sepsis, they told me in the fluorescent certainty of the ER. Pneumonia complicating everything else. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital, then another month learning to walk again at home, my bones relearning their names. During that time Brian, my husband of 12 years, Brian Anthony Martin, did the things everyone expects a spouse to do. He sat through 4 lines, he learned how to change a wound dressing. He answered the same questions the nurses asked me because I couldn't hold conversation past the second forgetful sentence. He was efficient. He was steady. He smelled like coffee and fabric softener and the faint tobacco smell from a long-ago college habit he kept, in secret, in the garage. The house smelled like antiseptic when I first came home. Bleach bright and the lemon of the Mr. Clean wipes he used obsessively. Takeout soups cooled on the counter. Dinner for the week portioned into plastic containers. Our cat, Hemingway, who had always preferred Brian's lap, backed slowly from me and watched with a practical, feline suspicion that didn't make anything lighter. At night, I slept in the same bed we'd bought together 10 years ago in a furniture store downtown. The one with the scratched footboard and the mattress that still smelled faintly of my childhood perfume. I needed help turning. I learned to accept alarms and to ask for help with swallowing pills. I learned to read the flicker of concern on Brian's face and interpret it as care. I learned to let myself be seen as small and human. What I didn't learn, not until the evening that changed everything, was how close someone could hold their heart to someone else's life, and how easily they could open the wrong door. The house is old enough that every floorboard has a memory. The hallway creaks in predictable ways. The bedside lamp throws an oval of light that Brian would adjust for me while I mumbled about widths of fabric or the name of a poem. I am intimate with small things. The pattern of the throw blanket, the way the curtains move when a truck passes. So when those details shifted, when the scent of someone's perfume layered over his coffee, I noticed it the way an instrument notices a single cracked string. It wasn't dramatic at first. Little things, a different toothbrush in the cup, a hair not my color on his jacket, a receipt for flowers that was not for me. But the small things stitched together into a pattern if you look long enough. The day I realized the scale of what had happened, I'd managed to get downstairs, breath measured. Brian had been at work. He did the double shift that week, trying to make up different kinds of debts. Debts you can name and debts you can't. Our son. No, we don't have children together. The house was just 2 adults and a cat. I crawled to the bedroom because I wanted to lie in our bed the way I used to, like a person trusted by the world. The bedroom door was ajar. Light pooled on the floorboards. The smell hit me before the sight. A floral sweetness that did not belong to any of my things. My heart tightened in a way that made my chest ache, a physical recoil. Inside, the bed was not empty. Brian lay against the pillows the way he always did, half-curled, but he wasn't asleep. Next to him, his arms were around a woman I had never met, at least not by name. She had the same breathy laugh I'd heard twice at a neighborhood barbecue years before, and discounted as small-town friendliness. Her hair spread over the pillow like spilled ink. Her hand rested where his did, as if ownership could be claimed by contact. When they noticed me in the door, the tenderness on his face slid off like wet paint. "Evie." He began, using the name he used when he wanted everything to sound smaller and safe. I should have cried then. Instead, my legs trembled and I felt the invention of a noise like I had been taught to breathe wrong. I forced my way to a chair, the world narrowing to the steady light on the bedside clock. I counted to 10 and tried to find the map back to speech. "Brian, how long?" My voice came out papery. "We." His mouth moved around a syllable he didn't own. The woman sat up. "Evelyn, I." She looked at me with the sort of pity I reserve for injured birds. Pity. In that room, pity felt like a lock turned in a door I didn't know how to open. I wasn't allowed to move fast then. My left leg complained. My oxygen cannula scraped my cheek. Every instinct told me to curl into the place my body had learned as safety, but my heart was a different muscle entirely, weaker than it had been before sepsis, less resilient. The woman, her name was Lauren, the name spilled out of Brian in the next frantic hour like a secret he couldn't keep, apologized in the soft voice of someone who had practiced being forgiven. "It was supposed to be my mom," she said, voice small. "He said it wasn't like this." Brian said nothing that made sense. He stammered. "He told me he'd been lonely at night. He told me he came home to someone who made him laugh. He told me that when I was sick, he felt like a stranger living in our house. He told me he had fallen in love." "Brian," I said, and it was the first time I used his full name in years, like a legal word pronounced on purpose. "While I was dying, was I? You were there. You watched me cough up bile and hand me clean towels. You listened to the nurses explain that I might not." He shut his eyes, which felt crueler than anything else. He kept his hands wrapped around Lauren. They both seemed startled when I stood. As if I was a ghost, the two of them had agreed to pretend didn't exist. The room smelled like betrayal in a way I couldn't wash away. For the first few hours after that, I tried to imagine how two people could hold such different truths in one house. I tried to find the math that would allow for it. My fights for oxygen, his small kindnesses, her laughter in our bed. I rehearsed conversations in my head. Questions that would land like knives, statements that would break like glass. I thought of leaving, of calling my sister, of summoning the kind of fury that felt like a promise. Instead, I felt like a patient waiting for a prognosis, not of my body this time, but of the life I thought I had. The bed, where I had learned to fall asleep to the sound of his fingers on the book's spine, had become a table where something else had been set down and labeled ours. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I'm telling you this because it's the truth that kept me up. The night closed around us and Brian slept on the side of Lawson, and Lauren curled like a private sun against his ribs. I sat in the hallway and let the darkness name every quiet thing. The oxygen machine ticked softly. Once, between breaths, I heard Hemingway jump up on the windowsill and stare out at the street like he was trying to remember before the world rewrote itself. I didn't know then that the discovery was the beginning of something else. Of questions about the past, of taxes and messages and receipts. I didn't know that the roof over my head would start to feel like a foreign country, one I would have to learn to navigate on my own 2 feet. But I did know this. While I had been fighting for my life, someone else had decided that our bed was a place to make themselves at home. I woke up the next morning with drywall-smudged dreams and a bruise in my chest that felt older than the sepsis scars. Brian wasn't in the house. He'd left before dawn, he said later, to get coffee and talk to Lauren. Phrases he couched in benign tones as if they couldn't hold the jaggedness inside them. Lauren had driven away when she thought I might speak to her. She left a lipstick mark on his collar and a note folded in the seam of his messenger bag. The note said simply, "Call me when you're ready," as if readiness had a calendar. The immediate practicalities. I couldn't throw him out. I didn't have the strength to pack a bag. Physical recovery and moral outrage do not coincide neatly. My body was still a thing of careful calculations. When to stand, when to rest, how many steps the hallway had before my knees protested. But I am also, stubbornly, someone who believes in the integrity of truth. The truth was that someone had slept in our bed who wasn't me. I started in the smallest place that felt like control. Brian's phone. Maybe that sounds low. peeking into someone else's messages. But what felt low was the idea that my bed could hold more than one heart and still be called ours. The phone became a ledger. His texts were tidy at first. Updates, short messages in circles of time. He had, over the months before my collapse, separated himself into other spaces. Lauren's name danced between them with soft slang. "Miss you. Come over. Don't tell Evie about tonight, she's fragile." The words hit me like the blunt edges of a lesson I had thought I'd never be taught. "How long?" I whispered to nobody. The hallway a confessional with chipped paint. When he came home that day there was an apology that smelled of recycled indignation. He had lined it up like a speech. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this. Love you. Love her. I'm sorry." He said the word love in a way that had been economized. It was meant to cover what couldn't be named. "You betrayed me," I said, and it startled me how flat my voice was. "You brought her into our bed." Brian's shoulders tightened, and for a moment I saw the man I had married, the one who taught me to tie my shoes when I sprained a wrist, who traced the margin of maps with his finger and planned vacations like annexes of hope. "Eve, you don't understand how lonely I was," he said. "You were somewhere else a lot of the time." Lonely. A word that can mean absence or neglect, depending on the gravity of context. I had been wrung by illness. Yes, but loneliness didn't give you permission to build a parallel life in my sheets. The more he explained, the more he revealed a pattern. Small nights out for work, unexplained withdrawals from our joint account, a second phone with encrypted conversations, a new set of keys clipped to his belt. "What did you tell her?" "Yes. That I wasn't going to make it out of the hospital. That I was dying." He faltered. "I told her you were vulnerable," he admitted finally, like someone confessing to a minor theft. "I didn't tell her that you were what the doctors said. I told her you needed caretaking." She understood what it meant to sit with someone. Understanding is not consenting. I wanted words that carried consequence. "Did you ever think of me?" "Yes. Not as an obligation, but as a person who breathes and worries and waits and forgives." He closed his eyes and the room emptied out there for a minute, like a recording with the track turned down. I thought. Then I stopped thinking. I didn't want to be the kind of man who watched you die and cleaned the house at the same time. There it was. A neat little rationalization that reduced the life we had built to an administrative task. My throat tightened in protest. In the months that followed, that sentence became a headline that followed me into doctors' offices and therapy sessions. I called my sister that afternoon. We had never been close. We were the kind of siblings who traded sarcasm for affection. "You need to leave," she said without hesitation. "Come to Cleveland. Stay with Mom. Take a break. Let him see the house empty." "How will I get my cane up the stairs?" I asked, and my voice broke in a way that made me hate its softness. "You'll manage," she said. "You deserve better." Deserve is a tricky currency. I felt robbed, not of material things but of history and expectation. The night I'd come home to find another woman in our bed had unspooled a list of other things. Bank statements that didn't match, credit cards with names I didn't recognize, a small jar of pills missing from the medicine cabinet. I realized then that betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was often material, a slow siphoning of trust into transactions. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. Talk to someone. I did, and the people I spoke with didn't give me platitudes. They gave me options. Legal counsel, a support group for partners of addicts, someone suggested that, and a local therapist who specialized in trauma and marital disruption. I wrote down names like they were prayers. There was whisper of something older too. In a drawer in the bedroom I found a faded Polaroid of Brian from 20 years prior, standing on a beach looking solemn. On the back in his hand was the name Lauren. It was like unearthing a fossil of a decision made long before I was sick. The photograph suggested continuity, that this new woman wasn't an accident but a return. When I showed him the picture, his throat closed. "She was a friend," he said. "She helped me when things were hard." "She helped you," I repeated. By getting into our bed. There is a particular shame in discovering something that rearranges your memory of a decade. I started to comb through our life for other small betrayals masked as compromises. The longer I looked, the more I found. A night he said he'd spent at the office that ended in 5 unexplained receipts at a downtown motel. A voicemail from a number I'd never heard that was affectionate and intimate. Photos on a cloud account that didn't include me. Each thing folded together into a map of a life lived partly in secret. Brian insisted on coming to his therapy appointments at first. He nodded, sometimes, as if therapy were an instruction manual he could skim. He filled the forms with the kind of honesty people reserve for parking tickets. "I don't want to lose my family," he told the therapist in a voice reedy with urgency. "But I'm in love with someone else." The therapist's face remained an even field. "Love is not a Boolean switch," she said, then explained that what he described sounded like an escape from responsibility and a search for validation in an easier script. Her words were kind but precise. They did not give him refuge. They did not make him less real. They asked him to name the cost. I learned to speak in truncated sentences at first, because each full sentence felt like an announcement of collapse. But speaking, however messy, was the only thing that slowed the dizziness. I started to keep a notebook where I wrote down interactions word for word, as if accuracy might root me. In the margins I left space to note what I felt. Anger, betrayal, an aching gravitational love for the man who could be both my caregiver and the one who had moved his bedmate into our life. "Has something like this ever happened to you?" I'd ask the group sometimes, and people would raise hands slowly. Friends who had their own versions of infidelity, secrets, or caregiving turned weapon. Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. Those small connections, virtual and hands-on, were stitches. They didn't mend everything, but they reminded me that I was not alone in a house full of private grief. The next step, the one that seemed like courage and the one that seemed like madness, was that I told him I wanted to see the bank statements. He was livid at first, as if money were another betrayal in itself. But the quiet of the ledger told a more damning story. Unexplained withdrawals, a line item to a boutique in the city, a recurring payment to a service with a name I did not recognize. Financial infidelity, it turns out, is as violating as anything else. It changes the obligations of a marriage into a ledger of partitioned loyalties. By the time Lauren's name became a slow echo in our house, my days were a series of choices. Whether to remain for practical reasons, whether to fight him in court for the things he had misappropriated, whether to let him see me as small again. I thought about the bed and the way it had been both literal and symbolic. How do you reclaim space from someone who has repurposed it? Brian said more than once. I don't know how to be any other kind of man. I wondered what he meant. Did the illness change him, or did it reveal something already worn thin? There is a cruelty to answers that are both true and also a betrayal. When I sleep now, months later, I measure how my mattress holds me differently. The linens are mine again, but the outline of another person lingers in the memory of the springs. In the next part, I will tell you how the truth of our finances and a secret from my own past came to be the final unspooling rope. How my sister found a name in a set of old letters that made us look longer at the map of our life and at what we were willing to fight for. The week after I discovered the bed, the house split into tidy halves. My life of appointments, of gull-wing bowls and little alphabets of pills. His life of late-night texts and brunches with a woman I had never invited into our shared history. I started to notice patterns. The way Brian would take longer showers when I had visitors, how he would step out to check on the cat, while his phone screen lit up with messages from Lauren. She was younger than me by a decade, quick to laugh, and adept at staying pleasant in the face of my presence. She apologized a lot, as if apology could make her small in the enormity of what she had done. One evening, when Brian was out and the house had the hum of a refrigerator and the thick Ohio summer pressing against the windows, I decided to do something that felt like crossing a line but also like righting a wrong. I logged into the cloud account on his laptop. It was open on his desk because he liked to keep things convenient, and habit overrode ethics for a breath. There's a weird intimacy to reading someone else's photos. You see the shape of a life in thumbnails. There were photos of Brian and Lauren that started like any couple's album. coffee shop frames, candid smiles, but then there were harder images. A hotel room with a takeout box on the dresser, an arm draped across the headboard, a lipstick stain on a glass. Then, tucked awkwardly between them, I found a set of scanned documents. Medical forms, handwritten notes, a letter that had my name on the envelope but not in the hand I had read for years. I opened it and the air in the room felt colder. The letter was from my father, who had died 10 years before my marriage. Its edges were soft, yellowed by time. The handwriting was his, angular and impatient, and the content was something I had never known. He had once had contact with Brian before I met him. A letter that suggested Brian had helped him in a difficult time, had offered shelter and anger and something like a promise. At the bottom, in a different hand, was a rebuke. "If you hurt her, I'll find you." The letter implied a history of closeness between my young spouse and my father, an intimacy I'd been blind to. I confronted Brian that night. "Why did you have letters from my father?" I asked. "Why did you keep them?" His face went tight, like he'd been grabbing at a fabric that wasn't there. "He was a friend," he said. "We helped each other. It's not what you think." "Not what I think." The letter added a layer I hadn't anticipated, a tether to a past that made the present uglier. I had to decide if this revelation was an explanation or another betrayal. Sometimes the past is an invasive species. It grows inside the present until roots snap foundations. "You worked with him." Probe. Before I met you." "Yes," he said. "We were younger. He came to me with problems. Talk. We." He stopped, and for the first time I saw the image of youth in his face. The man before me had been someone else entirely, someone less careful. What followed was an excavation, slow and sharp. I called my brother, who still had boxes of old clippings in his attic and a memory like a sieve. He came down on a Saturday with an unlit cigarette and a truckload of questions. "You never told me about letters," he said, thumbing through a photograph that included Brian at a funeral, his hand on my father's shoulder. It turned out Brian and my father had been entwined in ways I had never known. Financially, for a time, and perhaps emotionally. The revelation did not absolve him. If anything, it complicated my anger. If he had been part of my past, his betrayal felt like a sacrilege. Not only had he lied to me now, he'd been keeping a side of his life near the hinge of my family for years. It was as if the house itself had been built with hidden rooms. The more I dug, the more hazards I found. The bank accounts had been used in ways I couldn't understand. A sudden transfer to a clinic in the city, a paid sum to a therapist under an unfamiliar name, cash withdrawals at odd hours. I'd always considered money the practical part of a marriage, and now it felt like a betrayal ledger. Financial infidelity is a term I only truly understood when confronted with a credit card I hadn't authorized in my own name. How do you reconcile love with the ledger of its betrayals? I went to a lawyer. She listened with the kind of concentration that feels both clinical and bowl-deep empathic at once. "Most divorces don't feel like divorces in the at-first glorious sense," she said. "They are inventory lists and phone logs. They are carefully preserved evidence." She advised me to keep everything, to keep receipts and to photograph the bed for the record, of all things. "This is not about sensationalism," she said. "It's about the truth. Truth is slippery." There were nights when I wished for a simple evil, someone who announced their intent, a lover who had been visible and scorned. Instead, I had a mosaic of small deceptions that, summed up, made a portrait of someone I couldn't recognize. Lauren didn't stay long after the initial discovery, at least not in our house. She moved into an apartment not far from ours, and some afternoons I would see her leaving for work wearing a blouse I had once liked. There were conversations in town, of course. People are curious. They line up at the edges of calamity like spectators. Friends stopped texting me for a while, unsure what to do with the intimacy of my pain. The people who stayed brought lasagna and an economy of words. They told me to breathe. They offered up the practical kindnesses of people who loved me. I started going to a small therapy group for people who had survived infidelity. It surprised me that no one there was theatrical about their hurt. It was quiet, a room of small confessions. He never came home, a man said. She moved the children, a woman said softly. One older woman, probably in her 60s, took my hand and said, "You can be angry and still rebuild." Her words were an offering more useful than any platitude. But anger has a way of turning inward. There were nights I lay awake and rewound the moments to find where I had failed. You can do this with any trauma. Autopsy of the memory. If only I had called him back that Saturday, if only I had read his messages, if only I had been braver to ask questions about his finances. Self-blame is a heavy, localized storm. It stays close to the chest because it is familiar. In the middle of the unraveling, a secret from my past surfaced. A detail I had never shared with Brian. When I was a teenager before college, I had an abortion. It was an event that shaped me silently, a hinge I kept private. I had never told him because I feared judgment, and because some truths feel lodged where they can't be removed easily. Brian found the old medical records in a file box when he was looking for something else, and his reaction was a complex one. "You should have told me," he said. "We don't keep secrets." Maybe he was right. But the hypocrisy of his statement was electric. He demanded my honesty while petitioning his own. That discrepancy, more than anything, revealed a fundamental inequality. He had curated his life to be open on his terms and closed on mine. I began to imagine lines I might draw, contracts I might sign, a house split, a bed to be sold at a yard sale. The lawyer suggested separation papers. My sister organized a plan for me to stay with our mother for a few weeks to gather strength and documents. "Get your legs stronger," she said simply. "You can fight him from solid ground." What I didn't anticipate was the way a secret can sometimes be a lever. When I finally asked Brian to tell me the whole truth, everything spilled out in the way secrets do. Messy, self-serving, and incomplete. He admitted he'd been siphoning money to support Lauren after she left a bad relationship. He admitted it felt good to be desired by someone new. He admitted he was ashamed but not ready to stop. "I don't want to lose both of you," he said once, as if bargaining for a world that included my forgiveness. You can't bargain with someone else's heart. I realized then that some decisions make the future impossible. If he wanted both, it meant neither of our presences would be whole. The choice was mine to make, and that knowledge felt like a weight I had to teach myself to lift. In the quiet of that month, with bank statements fanned out like playing cards and old letters pressed between new wounds, I learned how to keep a ledger of my own, one where the entries were not receipts but promises I would make to myself. It started with small things. I promised to walk to the post office without asking someone to help me fold my cane. I promised to sit in the sun for 15 minutes and let the heat be a small, honest thing in my chest. I promised to demand clarity. The break, when it came, was not cinematic. There was no shouting match, no hotel window finale. There was paper and signatures and the strange administrative hum of divorce. Felt like taking inventory of the ruins. What remained, when Brian moved his things to an apartment across town, was quiet and a possibility that curved the room. Hemingway, who had always been impartial, followed my footsteps and purred in recognition when I sat down to write. I began to think about rebuilding not as returning to what was but as inventing what could be. That idea carried me into the next chapter, into a decision that would change not only where I slept but how I named myself in a world that had once defined me as wife and patient rather than person. In part for I'll tell you about the day I decided to reclaim my body and my space in a way I hadn't imagined possible, and the surprising ally who appeared in the form of a woman who'd once been a stranger. After the signing and the quiet removal of mismatched dinnerware, the house felt too large and oddly adult. Had been a shelter, then a stage, then a battleground. Now, with Brian's boxes gone, the air seemed to hold the space of a breath that might finally be wholly mine. But freedom is not a single act. It's the accumulation of small braveries. For me, the bravest thing was physical. Learning to trust my body again. I enrolled in outpatient physical therapy at a clinic a few blocks from my house. The building smelled like eucalyptus and the faint, antiseptic scent of institutional cleaning. The therapists had the soft eyes of people used to teaching the injured to find their feet. My therapist was named Nia, a woman in her 30s with a laugh that sounded like it carried a room with it. She had a way of guiding me through exercises that didn't make me feel small. "We rebuild," she would say, "one step and one breath at a time." The first time I walked into the clinic, my hands were bandaged with anxiety. In the corner, a bulletin board held faded Polaroid photos of former patients smiling with their canes like trophies. I felt ridiculous among them. But the motion of moving is a teacher. It doesn't care about your internal monologue. It insists on cadence. Nia started with balance exercises. "Imagine your core is a beacon," she said once, hands on my hips. "Feel it, then let your hands know where to hold you up." The metaphor made me smile despite myself. There is a peculiarly intimate trust in the hands of another when you are being taught to stand. At the clinic, I met other people with stories that sounded like shards catching light. There was a young man who'd lost the use of his legs in a construction accident and was always hungry with possibility. There was a woman my age recovering from a stroke, who had 2 children and a voice that sided with laughter more often than not. We became a small constellation of survival. It helped to be in a room where people knew what it was to build muscle without building expectation. I expected the healing to be linear. It wasn't. There were days when my left leg refused to cooperate and I would cry in the clinic bathroom, hands pressed to my knees. There were nights when the bed felt like an instrument that could not be relearned. But the steady work of therapy became a quiet rebellion against the idea that illness could define me. Brian could have my past in his small box of things, but he couldn't make me small. In the midst of this rebuilding, something unexpected happened. I got an email from Lauren. I nearly deleted it without opening it because the name felt like a bruise. Instead, I read. It was short. She said she would like to talk, not to ask for things or for a reconciliation, but to explain. She said she had made mistakes and wanted to own them. I wasn't sure if I could listen without the itch of fury resuming its reign, but curiosity and a desire to be the person who didn't live by retaliation made me agree to a meeting in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the clinic. The shop was small, with a single-serve machine that steamed milk with a kind of arrogance. Lauren arrived wearing a denim jacket and a face guarded in a way grief reads. "I know I hurt you," she began, and her voice was the kind we use for apologies that need to be substantial. At first I thought I was being kind. I thought I was helping him. I didn't know. She was younger than me, yes, but not by so much that I could dismiss her as naive. She had been someone who had loved a man who offered her a refuge, and she had not thought to ask whether that refuge was a home already claimed. "Did you know he was married?" I asked. "Not at first," she said. "Not how he said he was. When I found out, I left the house. I wanted to be honest. I wanted." Her words broke. "I wanted to be better." There was nothing easy about listening to this. It was a confrontation with the complicated truth that people are not monoliths of evil or virtue. Lauren had been an actor in a betrayal I did not author. Forgiveness was not a currency I had to exchange, but a tool I could choose to use or not. For me, the meeting with Lauren turned out to be less about absolution and more about adjacency. 2 people who had been injured by the same man could, for a moment, look at each other without the necessity of scorn. "You made choices," I said slowly. "We all did. But what matters now is what we do with the aftermath." She nodded. "I work nights now," she said. "I moved away from him. I see a therapist. I want to make amends where I can." Making amends, again, a phrase that looks tidy on paper yet requires the slow labor of restitution. It didn't change the fact that I had lost the shape of my marriage, but it opened a window into the reality that every adult in this story had agency and consequence. That idea settled on me somewhere like a coat of paint, not transformative but protective. As my body improved, I started to look at my life like a room I could rearrange. I took up writing, not essays for my old students but short, clipped pieces about mornings and oxygen and the domestic details that used to be invisible. I started a blog with a pen name at first, because there is safety in anonymity. The writing was a way to regain my voice. I had professional muscles I could flex again, sentences I could arrange like furniture. People reached out. Some offered practical help. Others shared their own stories of betrayal and recovery in private messages that read like letters to a confessional. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. I would add sometimes in a footnote because the world is pragmatic and kindness thrives on small exchanges. Then came the legal fallout. The divorce decree divided the house and the bank accounts in ways that felt both righteous and inadequate. Property once split feels like slices of a memory. I chose to keep the little things. My mother's chipped saucer, the bookshelf that had always stayed in the corner. Brian took what he wanted, and what he left behind was a map of the life we had once agreed to share. One late afternoon, Brian returned to the house to collect a piece of furniture. We stood in the hallway, both fragile, both armored in our own ways. "I didn't know how to be honest," he said. "I am sorry." I looked at him, and for the first time, the man I once loved was a stranger I had loved long ago. "I am too," I said. "I am sorry I couldn't be what you expected, and I'm sorry you hurt me. But I can't live with both of those truths at once." We didn't argue. The silence felt like a hand closing around something small and cold. Later I packed boxes with the help of my sister and took Hemingway and my favorite mug and put them in the trunk of her car. The house watched like a quiet neighbor. Moving out was not an explosion. It was a quiet, ordinary exodus. The day I actually moved into a small apartment across town, the space was narrow and smelled faintly of lemon and paint. There were 2 windows that let in the staggered sunlight of late summer. I set my bookcases up, placed the footboard we managed to carry in, and made the bed in a way that felt like ritual. It felt impossibly like a place I could learn to be new inside of. The first night in my apartment, the mattress felt like a small island. I lay there and listened to the city, the distant clatter of a freight train and the random laughter of people who were not dealing with hospital schedules or past affairs. I turned my face to the wall and let myself name everything I'd carry. Loss, yes. Rage sometimes. But also a surprising, stubborn relief. It was the relief of someone who has been granted back a portion of air. When you leave a marriage that has been breached, everyone expects you to either rage or to implode. The truth is messier. You pick up your life like litmus paper and see which colors remain. For me, what remained was the desire to be whole on my own terms, to be someone who could live with the knowledge of what had been done and still find ways to be generous with herself. I continued therapy and therapy group meetings. The woman in her 60s who had once told me, "You can be angry and still rebuild," became a friend of a sort. We shared coffee in a way that felt less like sharing grief and more like mutual companioning. She had survived abandonment twice and had the calmness of someone who had learned how to swim after being thrown into deep water. Brian attempted to reach out intermittently. Messages that moved from pleading to practical to passive-aggressive. "Can we talk about the cat?" he wrote once. I didn't respond. Hemingway had chosen me, and that was enough. When he did come by the last time to sign a piece of paper concerning our joint account, he looked like a man who had been carved down by regret. He apologized in that way that suggests an understanding of fault without the courage to inhabit it fully. "I wish you well," he said finally, and there was a truth to it. People who hurt us don't always remain enemies. They can be, eventually, people who once were important and now are simply in a different room of the house of our history. What surprised me most in the months that followed was the kindness of strangers and the small ways life offered me re-entry. A neighbor who'd seen me struggle with the stairs helped me carry groceries. A former student, now a college sophomore, sent an email about how the books I'd made him read had changed the way he understood language and the world. His message was a small vindication that I could still matter outside the story of my marital collapse. I took a job substitute teaching again, cautious and part-time, returning to the rhythms I used to know. The classroom's fluorescent lights and the sound of teenagers' teeth on pencil plastic felt like a vaccination against loneliness. It was noisy, imperfect, and altogether alive. Standing at the front of a class, I remembered how language could be used to liberate. I read a poem aloud and felt the words settle in my chest in a different way than grief had taught me. For the first time in a long time, my voice felt like mine, not borrowed for survival. People often ask, "How did you forgive?" and the question assumes a moral arc it doesn't always deserve. Forgiveness for me wasn't about Brian. It was about me. It meant refusing to be defined as a victim indefinitely. It meant learning to hold memory and possibility at once. I chose to forgive not because his acts deserved it, but because I did not want to live with the soil of rage in my teeth. Here's the painful truth. Forgiveness didn't make the pain vanish, but it made space for new music. I dated tentatively. I had coffee with someone quiet who liked crossword puzzles. It was not fireworks. It was small, a soft thing that grew shape. There were moments of fear of being used again, fear of not trusting my own judgment. But there were also moments of joy, like when a man in his 50s laughed at the wrong point in a joke and I found myself laughing with him. I also found unexpected solidarity in places I hadn't imagined. Lauren and I ran into each other at a community volunteer event where we both were teaching literacy to adults. She was more composed now, and we worked side by side, handing out pamphlets. We didn't erase the past, but we acknowledged that both of us had been young and hurt and also capable of change. There is a strange power in being able to look another woman in the eyes and not break. In time, I made a decision that felt both small and enormous. I planted a small garden out back, 2 tomato plants and some basil. Watching something grow was a faith practice. It was a daily check-in with the idea that nurturing produces fruit. When I picked my first tomato that August, my fingers stained slightly red. I thought of the bed I'd slept in for years and how beds can hold betrayal and healing. I tasted the fruit and it was sweet. To anyone listening to this, to anyone who has had their life overturned while they were fighting for themselves, there is no tidy map. There are small acts that help. The lawyer who helps inventory your life, the friend who shows up with lasagna, the therapist who makes you practice standing. There are also hard, necessary choices. To leave when your dignity is being eroded, to set boundaries with someone you once loved, to allow yourself to grieve the life that was promised. If this resonates, please consider subscribing and sharing your story in the comments. I'm reading everything. Your voice matters. The lesson I carry now is simple and stubborn. Survival is not just about staying alive biologically. It's about relearning who you are when the definitions you had are stripped away. My life is not less because it bears the bruises of betrayal. It is more honest. I learned to insist on clarity, to demand dignity, and to love myself in ways I had deferred. I learned that home is not simply a place where one person sleeps. It's a space you build from the material of your choices. Sometimes I still dream of the bed on a rainy night. The old springs creak in the mind, and the dreams are not always kind. Then I wake, and the first thing I do is reach for my phone and call my sister, or write a paragraph or water my tomatoes. Keep moving. That's how you rebuild a life. One breath, one step, one sunrise at a time. Thank you for listening. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything.